Hello and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Janine Shepard, Senior Manager of Philanthropy Events here at Food and Water Watch, and your host this evening for Livable Future Life. For any of you new to Food and Water Watch, welcome. We are a national organization fighting for safe food, clean water, and a livable climate for all. We organize for grassroots activism at all levels of government. local, state, and federal, and we work to create the change and the solutions we need. For any of you new to Livable Future Live, welcome. This is our monthly virtual education series. Each month, we focus on a different topic relevant to our livable future. Today, we will be discussing the topic of nuclear power. It's a hot button issue, with many environmentalists being told that nuclear power is a safe environmental solution. But I'll tell you right off the bat that our research tells a different story, and you'll hear more about that from our speakers today. We'll be hearing from Tim Judson, Executive Director of Nuclear Information and Resource Service, Food and Water Watch Research Director Amanda Starbuck, and New York State Director Laura Schindel. We'll be talking about the history and current trajectory of nuclear power in the US, our research and organizing work, and we'll close out the evening with Q&A. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of Zoom reminders. First, if you'd like to turn on closed captioning and add subtitles to your screen, click Show Captions in your Zoom toolbar. We'll add instructions for that in the chat as well. And if you have questions for our presenters, look for the Q&A icon. You can type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll get to as many questions as I can today. And finally, we are recording this event, and we will share the recording with you tomorrow in a follow-up email. I want to take a moment before we get started to acknowledge that we are all coming together in community today with a diverse set of backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences, but with a common belief in the importance of fighting for clean water, clean food, and a livable future for all. As you submit your questions, please make sure to keep them respectful. We will be monitoring the Q&A and will ask anyone not abiding by this request to leave the event. There are many ways for you to get involved with our work, whether that's joining our volunteer network, attending our events like you are right now, or supporting us with a donation. Thank you so much for being here and for showing up and for your generosity. The work that we do is people-powered in every sense. We don't take corporate funding, so we are not beholden to their interests. Our people-powered support comes from people like you, so that we can focus on the well-being of our communities and our planet. So thank you so much for the necessary support you are contributing to the work we're all doing together. And with that, let's begin our discussion. Tonight, I am joined by a few of my colleagues, and including our first speaker this evening, Tim Judson, Executive Director of Nuclear Information and Resource Service. Tim has investigated safety problems, informed community members of the dangers and pollution, fought to protect whistleblowers, and worked for solutions to our energy needs since 1998, including representing NEARS with Climate Justice Coalition, leading energy and environmental campaigns, working with whistleblowers, representing organizations in regulatory cases, and helping develop the successful campaign to close the Vermont Yankee reactor. Tim also has a background in the labor movement as a union member, organizer, and policy analyst. Tim, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenny. Thanks to Food and Water Watch for holding this event and for inviting me to participate in it. Just a little bit about, me and where I come from in doing this is, as, Jean mentioned, I'm with a national organization called the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We were established in 1978 to be sort of a national information and networking hub for frontline communities and grassroots organizations that were concerned about the impacts of nuclear power and radioactive waste and other fuel chain facilities, on their communities and on their health. But I come to this also as a grassroots activist where I live, 30 miles downwind from 3 nuclear reactors on the shore of Lake Ontario. And I got into this work as a grassroots activist, advocating and trying to protect my community. And so that's you'll see that reflected in what I present tonight. But what I was asked to do to start with was to provide sort of a background and an overview and history of nuclear energy in the U.S. And the environmental concerns that we have about it. So that's where we'll get started. So just as sort of a baseline, The U.S. has the largest nuclear power industry in the world. We have currently 94 reactors operating in the U.S. But they're very old on average. The average age of a nuclear reactor in the U.S. is over 44 years at this point. And that's because we haven't built many of them in a very long time. In fact, the oldest reactors in the U.S. are in New York State. They are the two, soon to be the two oldest reactors operating in the world. But the same thing, but there's similar trends going on throughout the country where we have almost 24 reactors that are over 50 years old already. That's the dynamic that was caused by the fact that basically in the first wave of construction in the U.S., exhibited tremendous problems with cost overruns and delays in construction that mounted to over 14 years of construction time by the time the last ones were completed, and averaged over triple their original cost estimates. Some reactors came in at 10 times their original cost estimate or more. But to give a sense of kind of what the expectations were versus what the reality was, President Nixon in 1970 predicted there'd be 1,000 nuclear reactors in the U.S. operating by the year 2000. And in fact, only 277 were proposed, and less than half of those ended up being built. Most of them were canceled. And that was sort of over a 50% cancellation rate of nuclear reactors in the first generation of nuclear power in the US. And then of the reactors that were built, close to a third of them, 42 reactors, have been retired. So we are now operating with 94 reactors, including the two new ones that were started up a couple of years ago. But the industry sort of saw itself reaching a cliff. And so about 20 years ago, they declared what they called a nuclear renaissance. And the Bush administration, as well as, in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, as well as legalizing what became to be known as fracking, also included billions of dollars to gin up a nuclear construction craze in the US. And that had, some effect, which is that utilities ordered 30, or they planned 30 new reactors within the next couple of years. But that basically started to quickly fizzle as the same problems came up again with cost overruns and predicted delays. So only 14 of those reactors, received licenses to begin construction. Only 4 ever began construction. And then within a few years, the construction of those 4 reactors bankrupted Westinghouse because of the cost overruns. So 2 of them were canceled after bankrupting one of the utilities in South Carolina. The 2 that were built were the 2 Vogtle reactors in Georgia, which came in 7 years late. The final cost of $37 billion, over twice as expensive as they projected. And then that has since caused a 25% rate hike on Georgia ratepayers, with lots of people having not able to afford their power bills now and getting their utilities shut off. But in effect, a nuclear renaissance had a 93% cancellation rate. So this was a really big egg on the face of the industry, which had tried to sell this idea of a nuclear renaissance. Since then, there's been this effort to gin up a second nuclear renaissance. And so there were, billions of dollars included in the Inflation Reduction Act to support that, as well as to subsidize and bail out the old existing reactors. And so, and as the Trump administration has sort of, reshaped the incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, now they're taking, they're reallocating funds that were supposed to be also for renewable energy and other types of energy projects, and sort of prioritizing access to those funds for nuclear projects. So, we don't know exactly how much all of this could end up being. Some of it depends on, whether the nuclear industry is able to actually get projects underway and get them completed. But there's potentially, over $300 billion in financing and incentives to try to make this crazy scheme a reality. Also, what they're talking about is, because the failure of the conventional light water reactors that use water for cooling, these large 1,000 megawatt plus reactors, they're now talking about a different kind of reactor, what they're calling advanced nuclear reactors. which is sort of a PR term. There's no consistent definition of what this broad array of technologies refers to, but you'll hear about small modular reactors, micro reactors, fast neutron reactors, sodium cooled reactors. There's a whole wider range of technology. What you need to sort of know is that the fundamentals of how nuclear power plants work don't change with these different types of designs. And also that all these technologies were tried 50 and 60 years ago. And we ended up with the water reactors we have today because the other types of reactors 50 years ago were already determined not to be very viable. Um, so the question is, what is a nuclear power plant and how does it work? That's essential to understanding why this has all failed. So a nuclear power plant consists of one or more reactors. And a reactor is basically a vessel to try to control a nuclear chain reaction. Um, as fuel, they basically use enriched uranium, and it's called enriched because the fissile isotope, the one that splits, is only about less than 1% of the uranium that's in the ground. And so that has to the concentration of that has to be increased several times to be concentrated enough to cause a nuclear chain reaction in a reactor core. But the basic, so what you see on the right is, a diagram of how a fission reaction works. U-235 atom splits, it shoots off a few more neutrons as well as other radioactive byproducts. Those neutrons hit other U-235 atoms, split those, and that's what a chain reaction is. But the basic way that the nuclear reactor makes electricity is, similar to a coal plant or a gas plant. They use heat to boil water to make electricity. It's just that the way that you make heat in a nuclear reactor is in this very dirty and dangerous way of splitting atoms, which releases tremendous amounts of heat and also creates radioactive waste. And, the pressures and the temperatures that exist inside reactors are immense. And the thing is that when you shut off a reactor, the problem is that this heat generation doesn't stop because of all this radioactivity that you've built up inside the reactor. So the whole game of operating a nuclear reactor is to try to keep this incredibly powerful fission reaction from going out of control. And so these are very complex machines that have to have really robust safety systems. And so, you have like the reactor vessel itself has to be 6 to 10 inches of thick steel. They're 40 feet tall. They weigh massive amounts. And then there's all this complex machinery inside the reactor vessel to try to be able to control this fission reaction. There's also a principle called defense in depth, which is that reactors have you have to have backup systems, backing up backup systems, backing up backup systems, because the truth is that that the consequences of an accident happening in one of these machines can be really devastating. And so you also have something called the containment structure, which is this sort of thick concrete and steel dome that encases the entire reactor structure, that is essentially the last line of defense to try to prevent the release of radiation in a meltdown scenario. All of which is what contributes to a lot of the cost of these projects is just the complexity and then the massive amounts of materials involved in doing it. But to start with, nuclear power is also similar to fossil fuels in the sense of where the fuel comes from. And producing nuclear fuel is also incredibly dirty and polluting. And so we have what we call the nuclear fuel chain, which starts with the mining of uranium in the ground, and then refining that and enriching it and fabricating the nuclear fuel. And then there's a whole back end, which involves all of the waste that's created, on the back end of the process as well. So on the front end, we have the front end of the chain, starting with uranium mining. There's a tremendous amount of radioactive waste that's created in mining of the uranium. Whether it's in hard rock mining or what they call in situ leach mining, which is similar in some ways to fracking. Then you have to sort of refine the ore that comes out of the ground. All of this produces even more waste. Then you have to enrich the uranium, which produces yet more waste. And then that all has to be fabricated into fuel, and those communities become contaminated as well. Then at sort of the center of the fuel chain, you have the reactor that operates and then generates a wide array of radioactive waste streams, both the irradiated fuel, the nuclear waste what we most think about, but there's a wide array of other radioactive waste that get produced, including releases that go directly into the air and the water of the reactor community as part of the routine operations, and then other streams of low-level waste, what they call low-level waste. It's really, it can be extremely radioactive, but that also gets shipped off to other communities and dumped there. And the reality is also that radio communities that have the communities of color get and indigenous communities get targeted disproportionately for radioactive waste dumping as well. Then when the reactor is done operating at the end of however many decades they operate it, the entire site essentially also becomes radioactive waste through the process of decommissioning because the sites become extraordinarily contaminated. All the buildings and the systems inside the reactor have become contaminated. And so all of this is basically radioactive waste. And those projects can cost $1 billion or more to decommission a single reactor. Then you're left with the irradiated fuel, which at this point has nowhere to go. And in fact, there is the federal government isn't even working on the repository program to create a permanent isolation facility for this waste. And so, reactor communities are stuck with an indefinite period of storage of this incredibly radioactive material. Now, there's a lot of talk about the benefits of nuclear power. And, what I want to share is, sort of a critical perspective of how reactors impact communities. And that is, there's a lot of talk about the jobs that get created. The construction phase is a bonanza of jobs that, can lead to thousands of workers being brought in to work on construction. Those are largely not local people. These are a lot of skilled trades, but also just a larger labor force than what the reactor community is usually able to supply. And so you get a lot of transient workers coming in with a lot of money in their pockets. And that leads to impacts in the community like housing prices going up and people not being able to afford to live, who've been living there for a long time. Then you get in the operation phase, permanent jobs working at the reactor. But what's often not talked about with the new reactors they're promoting now, like SMRs, is these reactors are being designed to have as few workers as possible. And so even the jobs benefits of these projects long term would be a lot less. As I mentioned, there's disparities that come with reactors, including a lot of economic inequality. There's also problems with crime and corruption that develop both through what I mentioned with like these man camps of temporary workers, but also the corporations themselves begin to basically assert control over the community and start exerting political influence. There's also a lot of secrecy and lies and intimidation. So the reactor companies withhold as much information as they want to about what's actually happening. So, for instance, I mentioned the radioactive releases that happen as a part of the reactor's operation. They don't tell the communities about this at all, and I can share stories about how that plays out. But there's also this sort of company town dynamic that takes place where people who have concerns are basically told to shut up because they're putting their neighbors' jobs at risk or the local school taxes and whatnot. There's also the constant risk of a nuclear disaster, and this is not something I generally focus on because the other impacts are bad enough. But as someone who lives in a reactor community, you're confronted with the potential of having to evacuate if something goes wrong at the plant. And the consequences of a nuclear disaster, can be quite extreme. Just as a for instance, you can see the numbers of people that had to evacuate from the Fukushima and Chernobyl disasters. The price tag for the cleanup of the Fukushima disaster ranges as high as $700 billion and it could take 100 years or more. So these are potentially devastating economic impacts, not just on the local community, but on the country as a whole. And then you have what to me are the most sort of, the most concerning issues, given what I've seen in my community and in other reactor communities, is the pollution and the waste and the health effects of what happens. So there are these, routine releases of liquid and gaseous rad waste, as well as leaks and spills and then the things, the mistakes that happen on site. Um, and then the shipments of low-level waste, quote unquote low-level waste, radioactive waste to other communities as well. Um, Now, the industry has been assiduous in not allowing very many studies to be done of the health impacts on reactor communities. But one where the community did fight for and got one was in Western Massachusetts, where there was which today by our standards a relatively small reactor, smaller than some small modular reactors today, where they found an epidemic of disease in a small rural community in the Deerfield River Valley, with multiple forms of cancer, as well as other infectious diseases and heart disease, and a tenfold increase in Down syndrome, as well as escalations in miscarriages and birth defects. So this is, I mean, rather than being a clean source of energy, this is a highly toxic form of energy. It's just that the government and the industry don't want to look at it that way. So what a lot of most communities are faced with is relying on what we call anecdotal evidence, which is, basically the evidence of our lives. And so I can tell you from where I live in central New York, in Oswego County, both we know how much radiation was released at least several decades ago. And we've seen, the impact of that, in various things that have happened, such as farmers reporting high rates of cancer and mortality in their herds. Um, the county refusing to allow Cornell University to even do a study of it. I know someone personally whose both of her parents were diagnosed with fatal brain tumors within 2 weeks of each other. There's roads that surround the plant where there's dozens of cases of people dying of cancer, living close to the facility. And then, we, have done canvassing in Oswego County, where we, going door to door asking folks, sort of how they feel about things. And people can just point down the block and, to their neighbors who have cancer. And so this is what we call anecdotal evidence. But the fact that the industry hasn't allowed any scientific studies to be done of it doesn't erase what we know to be true and what has happened. So in terms of the scope of all this, they build reactors in, mostly in isolated communities, but this industry has a national footprint. And you can see that in these series of maps, showing different sort of ways in which the nuclear industry touches communities and touches states, both in terms of the accumulation of high-level radioactive waste, um, other kinds of nuclear facilities, both on the nuclear weapons side of things and on the other parts of the nuclear fuel chain. And then the legacy of this going back to World War II and even before, but specifically with Manhattan Project sites that were scattered around the country. And, for instance, in New York, we have 79 locations in the state of New York where work on the Manhattan Project was done in secrecy. And then you have, this sort of global scope of it, where, for instance, there's places all over the country and other parts of the world that are sending radioactive waste, into this country to be dumped, in this case, at the White Mesa Mill on Ute Mountain Ute territory in Utah. And there is this very sort of, intimate connection that the nuclear industry has to environmental injustice. And that's why what we sort of say when the topic of, nuclear power and climate change comes up is that this industry is too dirty, too dangerous, too expensive, and too slow to be a climate solution. And it's rooted in environmental justice and human rights violations throughout its operation.
Yeah.
And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Tim, for that overview of the history and the science of nuclear power and how we got to where we are. And I appreciate the fact that you're highlighting, how this affects real people, real lives. It's heavy stuff. I saw the question come in asking if we'll make the slides available, and we will be. I will be sending those all out tomorrow in an email. So you'll have access to those. And I'm also seeing questions about small modular reactors, which brings me to my next speaker. I'm going to go ahead and bring you up here, Amanda. Thank you so much, Tim. All right, our next speaker this evening is Amanda Starbuck. Amanda is Food and Water Watch's research director. Like I said, a lot of us have been told that small modular reactors, often referred to as SMRs, are smaller, safer version of a nuclear power and the key to our energy future. But Amanda's team has researched this claim, and she is here today to share our findings. So Amanda, I will pass it over to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Great. Thank you for letting me speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this new technology that's getting a lot of attention, small modular reactors, and really, kind of just dovetailing off of what Tim just said. It's just really a way to try to repackage an old idea and try to make it seem new and, sexier and easier to deploy. So the idea that these are safer, quicker to deploy, and cheaper alternatives to conventional nuclear plants is wrong, and we're going to go through that tonight. We're also going to share in a link to a fact sheet that we produced recently on small modular reactors. So very quickly, what are we talking about here? SMRs are often called small modular reactors, are smaller than conventional nuclear plants, so maybe up to about 30% capacity of a conventional plant. They hover around, 300 megawatts of energy. So again, about a third of a big plant. But small is relative. I mean, these can be larger, they can be smaller than that. And the designs still include multiple buildings and can cover several acres of land. The modular part is the idea that we can produce these factory built units, transport them to a site and install them there. So the idea of kind of like a modular house, right? This factory construction. And just like all sites of power plants, they still produce a lot of heat and need to be cooled primarily by water, although there are ideas for, different types of cooling as well, liquid, metal, and gas. But we're still in very much the proof of concept here. There have been hundreds of designs, most of them still stuck in the concept design stage. Only a few of them have actually began construction. There's only about like 3 or 4 globally in the world right now. So again, this is still promises of a technology that has not yet been realized. Again, examples of a technological fix that's gaining a lot of hype and investment, but still is unproven, and it's really just delaying our attempts to really transition to a renewable energy future. So just keep this in mind when you hear about any hype around small modular reactors or SMRs. The idea that they're getting cheaper is even up for debate. For instance, in order for this modular design to be realized and cost saving, it needs to be deployed on a very large scale, and we're just not there yet. Good example of a failing project is the US tried to build a NuScale SMR project at the Idaho National Laboratory. It was funded through Department of Energy grants and cost sharing. But just like we saw in Tim's presentation, the cost overruns just kept expanding and expanding. Costs just kept going up. And at the end, the electricity still would have been more expensive than electricity produced by solar and wind, even with all of these generous government subsidies. So again, vibes with the trend of nuclear projects experiencing more cost overruns than other types of energy projects. And, once again, these are all speculative claims. The idea that it's going to be safer, require less investment, have a smaller footprint. We don't have real world examples to really back this up. So are they safer? So again, we don't have a lot of evidence to the contrary. They're using, in some ways, novel technologies, proposing novel types of coolants instead of water, and these still need to be reviewed and validated by agencies that assess nuclear safety. And it needs to meet, in order for a typical capacity to be met, you have to build many more of these to meet what would be met by a single conventional nuclear plant, right? So that just brings nuclear to more neighborhoods, especially as they are thought of a way to, bring power to population centers. Another problem too is, you talk about when you have a nuclear plant or, a gas plant or whatever, you have an emergency planning zone. So if like the worst case scenario happened and there was, toxic chemical or radiation released, how far of an area would be covered by that? Now you can shrink a nuclear plant and that emergency planning zone shrinks, but it's not necessarily proportional. And studies are saying that, it might shrink a little bit less than the full size of the plant does, meaning that emergency planning zone does not shrink by the same amount. And again, you'd have to build multiple of them in order to meet that same energy demand. So that's bringing more planning zones, more risk zones to different areas. And this just assumes that, small modular nuclears would be required to create emergency planning zones and plan for these events. Regulations that have been drafted by the US Nuclear Regulatory Commissions have proposed amendments to really carve out alternative pathways for SMRs and even maybe exempt them from some of these emergency planning plans, just on the assumption that's unproven that they aren't posing risks to areas outside of their own footprints. Another worry about risk too is that there's proposals to use SMRs to power industrial facilities, military facilities, facilities that themselves could be targets of attacks that again would impact, the adjacent SMRs. So when it comes to safety, and we talked a little bit about waste in Tim's presentation, but it's worth revisiting. These problems don't go away with a small reactor. You still have to mine, you still have to enrich uranium, and again, you still have to dispose of that spent nuclear fuel. So on the mining side, we've already covered how it's, a long legacy of environmental contamination, environmental injustice. Workers at mines pose risks of contracting lung cancer. Uranium can even bind to agricultural soils, and that can cause plants to take up uranium, but we don't really know what happens when you eat plants and how much ends up in our food system. It's also a limited resource. We have about 150 years left of uranium at our current consumption levels, and this is going to deplete even quicker if we deploy SMRs widely. And in fact, studies suggest that an SMR might even use more uranium per kilowatt hour of energy produced than a conventional plant. So going through that stockhold even quicker. And of course, we have the spent nuclear fuel issue, which we've already talked about. This is still highly unstable and needs proper storage. But the US, like most countries, does not have a permanent deep geological storage facility to store it safely. So a lot of times, these are just being stored on site. Again, increasing the risk if an incident were to happen at these plants that, that waste could as well have a reaction. So and also it continues to leak. So there's an investigation looking at conventional reactor sites, and 48 of the 65 investigated actually had leakage from these spent nuclear fuel into the environment. This included the spent fuel getting into drinking water. So that's another huge concern. And SMRs don't, again, eliminate this risk. They still produce, spent nuclear fuel that still has to be stored somewhere. And studies suggest that they might actually increase the volume of this spent nuclear fuel compared to a conventional plant. So we already know that on the mining side and the waste side, SMRs are a false solution here, but there's more. There's also the water footprint we need to consider. We are entering a new world where water scarcity is only going to increase. And nuclear actually consumes and withdraws more water than any other type of energy source, even more than coal and natural gas. So here you see on the red bar showing water withdrawals, water that is withdrawn to cool power plants versus consumed, which is water that does not get put back into the environment. So on both fronts, nuclear tops the charts here. About twice, what is it here? 90 cubic meters of water per megawatt hour produced is what it requires to cool these plants. So twice that of natural gas and thousands of times more than wind or solar that have microscopic water use in comparison. So in summary, we have the capacity now to rapidly deploy clean, renewable, and affordable wind and solar energy and battery storage, and we cannot afford to wait another 10 and 15 years on this unproven technology that will only exacerbate radioactive waste and consume our precious water resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for all of that information. I know there are a lot of questions coming in, and we will get to as many as we can here. But first, I'm actually going to bring Tim back on stage here to talk about the current national political context that we find ourselves in right now.
Sure. Thanks, Janine. And thanks, Amanda. That was a great presentation. What we have happening right now politically is basically a dumpster fire. And I am going to sort of walk you through what's happening. But the main sort of dynamic that's also the other sort of dynamic that's taking place is that the industry, has been lobbying both sides of the aisle in Congress for for over a decade now. And so we have a situation where, there's been a wave of legislation aimed at trying to gin up this sort of second nuclear renaissance, quote unquote, over the last several years. And so there's been, people in both parties sponsoring various pieces of legislation that essentially are trying to, force the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to prioritize approving new reactors over safety standards. And so you see a list of a number of the bills here, as well as the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure bill that provided a bunch of subsidies, but that has continued even up to 2 years ago. The reality is that is, as I mentioned, providing massive amounts of public investment available to gin up this new wave of reactor construction. But the reality is that very little is actually happening. As I mentioned from 20 years ago, there were utility companies that planned on building 30 new reactors. Those, are standard utility companies that build energy infrastructure, that have access to ratepayers to charge for the cost of building it. Today, almost no utilities in the US are actually already planning to build any of these new reactors. These are mostly startup companies that have never built or operated anything before. And they have also gotten very little of what they're proposing to do approved. So this is a list of some of the leading designs for these quote unquote advanced reactors. And as you can see that, the one that Amanda mentioned, NuScale, it, got a partial design approval for its reactor, but it canceled its first project. One sponsored by Bill Gates in Wyoming, this Natrium reactor has a construction permit, but they haven't begun construction yet. And then others are still going through, various approval processes, but haven't actually begun building anything and don't have approval to build anything. And then, as you can see here, this is the status of reactor projects that are going through some type of a regulatory approval. There's very little actually happening right now is the basic point of this. And so what the Trump administration has done in the last year is they are basically trying to, to deregulate the industry on this notion that if there were no regulations of any kind, nothing standing in the way, that this industry would somehow spin up and begin building reactors overnight. And this is really dangerous because, as I mentioned, this technology has inherent environmental and public safety risks. And in the 1970s, the Congress passed a law abolishing the Atomic Energy Commission in order to separate the regulatory and promotional functions. And they created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission so that the same agency wasn't promoting nuclear power as the one that was regulating it. And the Trump administration has already torn that barrier down in the last year. And so this is showing you sort of the wave of actions and developments that have happened just in the last 12 to 13 months that are tearing apart the system of regulation and safety regulation around nuclear energy. Some of which we believe is really illegal, but they're doing it anyway. Trump has also taken a number of presidential actions. He sort of instituted DOGE authority over the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There's been massive staffing cuts at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, especially, we believe, impacting safety inspections and enforcement. He's also basically sort of told the commission, which is supposed to be an independent commission that's not subject to political influence. He's basically sort of decimated that as well by firing commissioners and and appointing people who are basically doing what he wants. Then there's been a number of sort of investment deals that have involved nuclear energy, most notably the Japan investment deal announced last summer with $100 billion of Japanese investment in U.S. Reactor projects. We haven't seen much of that money moving yet, partly because, as I said, there's hardly any projects moving forward right now. He also took the unprecedented step of cutting a deal with Westinghouse, which, despite being bankrupt a few years ago, is still the only company with a proven design that can be built for a reactor, for the U.S. to basically take an ownership share of Westinghouse if it actually gets up and going again. And then there are various export deals that they're negotiating with Saudi Arabia and Poland and other countries to try to export U.S. reactors to other countries, but also could involve, with Saudi Arabia, dual purpose infrastructure like uranium enrichment and or reprocessing that could basically also enable Saudi Arabia to develop a nuclear weapons program. But what's also driving a lot of this are these executive orders that he issued last year, which are, again, sort of asserting presidential control over parts of the nuclear industry. Um, to reinvigorate the nuclear industrial base. This is to get a bunch of new reactors under construction in completely unrealistic timelines. Um, and then also to order, but the one that's I think of most direct concern to safety is the ordering of the reform of the NRC, which is essentially trying to remake this agency to expedite licensing deadlines, but also to do these staffing cuts, also to drastically cut radiation standards, which is the basis for all nuclear safety, is the radiation standards. And so if the radiation standards are cut, then essentially all bets are off in terms of the safety of reactor designs and the safety of communities. Um, and again, directing the NRC to prioritize licensing approvals over inspections and enforcement, and to cut our hearing rights to get a hearing on reactors that are proposed in our communities. The DOE is also actively sort of advancing this agenda by creating what they're calling the reactor pilot program, which is approving reactors to be built in various states without any public information and without any opportunity to get a hearing and without any environmental reviews. Again, we believe that much of this is illegal, but it's going forward right now, and and there's not much of a way to stop it except for filing legal challenges. Now, the danger of all this goes back to what happened at Fukushima, the three meltdowns that occurred in 2011. And when Japan's government looked into the causes of that disaster, what they found is that the fundamental basic root cause was, not the earthquake and the tsunami that initiated the disaster, but the lack of an independent regulator and the fact that the regulatory decisions were being made on the basis of the industry's economics and the politics around that. And rather than learning from that example, the Trump administration is recreating that in the U.S. now. That should be of concern to everybody. So I'll wrap up there.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Very concerning. We have one more speaker that is going to talk for just a minute about some of the work that we're doing as an organization in the state of New York. So let me bring Laura up onto the stage here. There we go.
Hello.
This is Laura Schindel. Thanks for being here, Laura. Laura is the New York State Director on the organizing team, and I'm just going to hand it right over to you and let you tell us all about it.
Thanks so much, Janine. I'll be brief, but just to zoom in on a particular state and what's going on here in New York. You can see here that there's a map of the existing nuclear power plants that, like Tim mentioned, are extremely old. We have 4 reactors in upstate New York. And then you'll see there's also a dot in downstate New York for Indian Point, which is in the process of being decommissioned thanks to fierce advocacy. I also want to mention there was a nuclear power plant that was built and paid for on Long Island, but never became operational because ultimately the community fought back so hard that they didn't sign off. And in fact, Long Islanders are still paying for that unused nuclear power plant at Shoreham on Long Island. And so currently our existing mix of nuclear power is 3.6 gigawatts. You can remember that number because it'll be relevant in a bit. But because these plants that we have in New York are so old and almost the oldest in the world, they're no longer profitable to run on their own. So they've required massive bailouts. So just a few months ago, our governor, Kathy Hochul, approved a $33 billion subsidy paid for by ratepayers to bail out those upstate nuclear reactors that are so old. And this is the largest subsidy to any single energy corporation in New York history. and just a massive corporate handout that we have to pay through increased electricity bills. And I'll say it's also not the first of its kind. We also bailed out the non-profitable aging nuclear power plants in 2016 under the Cuomo administration with a $7.6 billion bailout. And despite that we are bailing out these old reactors, Governor Hochul still wants to build more of these financial disasters. Over the last year or so, she's announced that she wants to build 5 gigawatts of new nuclear power plants. So that's the equivalent of 5 new traditional massive reactors or a hell of a lot of small modular reactors. And like Tim mentioned, since we hadn't been building nuclear power really since, the last century, that's more nuclear power than the entire US has built in decades. And that's what Governor Hochul aims to build just in New York. So she's already started making this happen in some ways. She directed the New York Power Authority to spend 40 million on nuclear workforce development. And she's even had her agency NYSERDA commit to giving money to help Constellation Energy, the company that owns those reactors upstate, money to apply for a permit that we don't even think they really need. And if they did need it, they should apply with their own money. And yet Governor Hochul's making, their application process much easier. So why would she be doing this? They're a financial disaster. They're an environmental disaster. Why would we do this? The answer is data centers and big tech. And I'm sure you're all groaning at home because none of us want those either. And it's just a big disaster. Luckily, resistance is building, and just in New York, we've had over 200 groups sign a letter opposing the governor's plan to build all this new nuclear. There's been massive indigenous resistance, led by the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, who's also fighting these plans for new nuclear. And there's more resistance to come. We've got a big statewide day of action on June 30th in New York. You can scan that QR code or follow the link that will be posted in the chat to find an event in New York near you. They're happening across the state on June 30th and July 1st. So you can take action so we can show local resistance to these plans and statewide resistance, because that's what it's going to take to beat these power plants. And if you don't live in New York, really fighting these power plants is different on a state to state basis. So that was an example of New York, but I encourage everyone who wants to get active to text nuclear to the phone number on your screen, 23321. That will opt you into text messages about this topic from Food and Water Watch, so that if there's a comment period in your state or nationally that we need you to get involved with or make a call about, you'll be in the know and get that update. So that is my bit.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
And I'll have you actually just stay on the screen and bring everyone back on the screen. We have just a few minutes left, but we have lots of questions, so we're going to get to as many as we can here. Let me add you all back on. Let's see. There we go. All right. Thank you all so much. I am going to dive right in. I know that we'll keep getting questions as we go here, so thank you all for sending your questions in. Let's see. Let's start off with this question. There are a lot of questions about communicating this issue and talking about, maybe we've heard this presentation, we understand this now, but why do so many environmentalists still support nuclear energy? What can we do to help them understand what we've learned today?
I'm sure I can take a crack at that. So I think there's a lot of confusion about nuclear energy, in part because it's been a long time since there was a big focus on it. And the industry, as I mentioned before, has devoted a lot of resources into public relations and lobbying and other kinds of disinformation in the last few years. And so, I think that there is a sense that, if all these politicians and all these newspapers and journalists are talking about it, then there must be something to it. But I think the reality is if you scratch the surface, on all the various topics that Amanda and Laura and I have talked about, you'll find that there's really nothing there except for a lot of wasted money, a lot of wasted time, and a big mess. And so I think that it's events like this that I think enable us to enable people to get better informed, as sort of an entry point, into finding out more on their own as well.
Yeah, thank you. Um, let's see, we have a number of questions about the science of nuclear reactors. One of them is that, Tim, for you, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, the small reactors will generate even more high-level radioactive nuclear waste per kilowatt hour than the old one. Why is this?
Yeah. So look, I'm not a nuclear physicist, so what I understand from reading what other people who are technical experts, are able to explain. But it's basically that as I mentioned, there's a lot of the fission process involves a splitting of a lot of atoms, and that's neutrons that are shooting out of these split atoms that then hit other atoms and whatnot. So in small reactors, there's not as much fuel for those neutrons to hit. And so they end up shooting out, into the reactor and everything else around it, and making those things radioactive. And so but then the other part is because the small reactors are less efficient with splitting atoms, you also need to have more nuclear fuel per amount of electricity you want to generate. And so for the amount of electricity you're generating, you're just gonna you need to you need to be making more radioactive waste in these smaller reactors.
Yeah, thank you. Um, let's see, Amanda, we have a lot of questions about waste storage. Is is waste storage one of the reasons that nuclear is so bad? And are there places that we know waste storage is being stored safely?
Yeah, it's one of the many, 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 many reasons that nuclear is a bad idea, but it's a big one. Nobody wants to live next to spent nuclear fuel. Nobody wants to have that in their backyard. And this isn't something you just store for a couple of years. It's indefinitely. I mean, it has to be there for millennia, and longer. And so that's a huge commitment that communities are really unwilling to, and I don't blame them, to have in their backyards. And then the risks that come to that, again, not only from, a big incident where that could be released, but also just, leaching into groundwater, getting into soils and all the other impacts that can happen to it. So it's one of many problems with the whole life cycle of nuclear.
Yeah. Tim, do you have anything you want to add? I know there's a number of questions about, like, is there any discussion anywhere within the government about safe containment for nuclear waste?
I mean, no. In fact, that's one of the things that's so I mean, the reactor communities are really on the front lines of is when they start talking about building a new reactor in your community, what they're really promising you is that you're going to have a bunch of nuclear waste sitting there forever. But I think also, when you look at also the environmental justice impacts of all this, like there is not a radioactive waste dump that's been built, that I know of in the world that hasn't leaked. And so, even when they're taking, low level, quote unquote, low level radioactive waste from a reactor, to a licensed dump, they're just dumping that waste in the ground, and that waste leaks out. And that also has impacts on water and on health and on the community.
Yeah, thank you. Um, there are quite a few questions about, basically, to sum it up, if not nuclear, then what? So if we're saying, that nuclear is a bad idea, does that mean that we're sticking with burning fossil fuels? What are we able to do? Amanda, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely not. You do not need to stick with fossil fuels. I mean, nuclear is a distraction from where we really need to be going. The science, the economics, the moral justice issues of it all point towards renewables. I mean, to say that we need to go nuclear when it takes, a dozen to 2 dozen years just to get it on the ground, when all these risks are here and it costs more and consumes more water than, renewables that we already have at our fingertips that we can already deploy, not to mention increased efficiency in battery storage so that we have energy when the wind doesn't shine and the sun doesn't, or when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So we're there. What we're just lacking is really the political will to move us where we need to be.
Thank you. Let's see. Here's one that came in live. Can you discuss the concerns with extending the licenses of existing reactors well beyond their original life cycle?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, like the machines are getting old. Some of them are approaching 60 years old now, and no reactor in the world has operated for that period of time. And so these machines are, they're becoming more embrittled. They don't actually make parts for these old reactors anymore. A lot of them are having to basically, as they're replacing valves and stuff, they've got to retrofit them with a valve that's different than the one they were originally built with. But to give you a sense of it, so a few years ago, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as they were looking at extending licenses, not just from 40 to 60 years, but now from 60 to 80 years, which is happening to dozens of reactors around the country right now. They commissioned a study by one of the DOE labs about essentially, is this safe? And a first version of that report came back and said, look, you're not doing testing of these reactor components to see, how they're aging and whether whether after being subjected to all this radiation and heat and stress, whether these reactors would be safe to operate. There's not a safety basis for extending these reactors any longer. And that report was published online. When it was, when a member of the public brought it up at an NRC meeting, the NRC pulled it from the website and had the DOE do the same thing. And they didn't repost it again until later when that language was removed. And so we're sort of whistling past the graveyard on the safety of running old reactors for indefinite periods of time. And that's something that that really none of the government agencies are really looking at right now.
Oh, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. There are a number of questions that are asking the question of who the main drivers are behind this nuclear renaissance. How much of this demand for new nuclear power is related to the explosion of construction of energy-hungry data centers, and who's profiting from nuclear power?
Well, yeah, I think that clearly there's a lot of sort of political drive coming from the data center expansion. The big tech companies are announcing lots of deals with nuclear power companies. The reality is that this is a big smokescreen. So as I mentioned, like there's no nuclear reactors under construction today. So the idea that any new nuclear reactors are going to be powering data centers that are going to be built in the next few years or that are operating today is a fantasy. There are some deals where the tech companies are cutting deals to buy power from existing reactors. Even some of those aren't really power deals. They're basically paying subsidies to the company. But even in the cases where they're buying electricity, that's electricity that was otherwise going onto the grid to power other things anyway. And so the reality is that the additional demand that these data centers are putting on the grid is in many places of the country being met by running gas plants and coal plants more. And so that's, I think, the reality that the data center industry is trying to cover up, by making all these announcements about deals with nuclear companies.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we are coming up on time, so I'm going to wrap this up. But thank you so much, Tim Judson, Laura Schindel, Amanda Starbuck, for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. Thank you all for your great questions that you sent in today. We will be sharing all of this in an email tomorrow, and it will include the links that Laura shared of ways for you to get involved as well. So before you go, I just want to share a couple extra things with you. Let me remove your spotlights here. All right. So thank you all again for taking the time to be here with us tonight and sending your questions. Again, text nuclear to 23321 to stay informed on this issue, and text GIFT to support the work that we're doing to fight against the buildout of nuclear power plants. This work takes an incredible amount of support and people power. Your investment increases the impact that we can have and makes possible the important research like what Amanda presented today. You know as well as I do that we're up against global challenges and heavily moneyed interests, but we will continue to fight to protect clean water, safe food, and a livable climate. We don't take any corporate funding. We are not beholden to any corporate interests. Our interest is in the health of our communities and our planet. So thank you so much for your generosity. Next month, Food and Water Watch will be taking a break from Livable Future Live, but please watch your inboxes for an invitation to our year-end Livable Future Live review and an invite to our August webinar. And lastly, please consider taking the short survey that will pop up on your screen in a minute. We would love to know what you thought of this event, how we could make it better, and what kind of speakers and topics you'd like to hear from and about in the future. Thank you again for joining me tonight. Please watch your email inboxes. We'll be sending out a recording of this event tomorrow, along with all the resources we shared tonight. Take care and see you next time.